In this video, we'll be exploring a capriccio by the Italian composer Luigi Legnani, which is a charming and humorous little piece taken from a larger collection of works, namely his 36 caprices of Opus 20. Although technically it's one of the easier caprices, there's no lack of personality or room for expression, making it a great starting point if you'd like to begin exploring this collection of works. You can download the sheet music for free at the link below. Before we dive into the piece, I think it's a good idea to learn a little bit about the composer's life to better understand the context of the music. Luigi Legnani was a man of many talents and actually enjoyed 3 careers in his long life of 87 years. His first professional musical engagements were actually not as a guitarist, but as a tenor, singing in operas by Rossini and Donizetti. It wasn't until 1819, at the age of 30, where he debuted as a guitarist at the famous La Scala Theatre in Milan. As a guitarist, he enjoyed a successful career, touring several countries in Europe. His compositional output was impressive, producing about 250 works, mostly for guitar solo, but some duets with flute and also a method book. He retired from performing in 1850, at the age of 60. The last portion of Legnani's life was spent in the city of Ravenna, where he devoted himself to instrument construction, building guitars and violins. Something I find interesting about Legnani's unusually long life is that he actually outlived a number of very famous composers. Legnani grew up at a time when Beethoven and Paganini were revolutionizing music. Both Sor and Giuliani were active at the time, and to some degree you can hear influences of their music in Legnani's. He was a contemporary of Rossini and lived long past Schubert, Johann Caspar Merz, Felix Mendelssohn, Frédéric Chopin, Robert Schumann, and Giulio Rogondi. I find it fascinating to think about the interactions he must have had with these composers, however fleeting, during his years touring Europe. Legnani's caprices were published in 1822, and were most likely inspired by the famous 24 caprices for solo violin by Niccolò Paganini, who apparently had a friendly relationship with Legnani. And just as an aside, although Paganini is best known for his violin works, he wrote quite a few works for guitar, and many duets for guitar and violin as well. And while we're on the subject of Paganini, something you may find very interesting is a video of a trio playing Paganini's own instruments, which I'll link below. The guitarist, Matteo Mela, is a fantastic artist, and I would recommend anyone to explore his albums. He definitely inspired me to explore Legnani's works when I heard him play a handful of caprices in concert, and when I heard his album featuring works of Legnani, Paganini, and Giuliani. Legnani's 36 caprices appear in all major and minor keys, and have a wide variety of character to them. Some of them sound like something you'd hear directly from a comic opera, such as Capriccio No. 2 in E minor. While others have a more slow, stately, Beethoven-esque feel to them, such as Capriccio No. 28 in C major. others are just pure virtuosic displays, such as Capriccio number 36 in E major. Like all of Legnani's pieces, this caprice fits quite well under the fingers because, of course, Legnani was himself a guitarist. And I find this kind of idiomatic writing to be quite refreshing because as guitarists we become a little bit too used to playing awkward arrangements of pieces written for other instruments. The opening phrase, or what you might consider the theme of this short little piece, occurs 3 times, and in terms of measure numbers, it actually takes up half of the piece. And to me, this phrase is all about thirds in some form or another. The upper voice is composed almost entirely of thirds. Whereas the lower voice moves in contrary motion to this, but also features the leap of a third. So as I mentioned, this is one of the easier caprices. It's in the relatively comfortable key of A minor. It has a lot of work in first position with very comfortable chord shapes. And compared to the other capricci, it's not so fast. But if there's one issue I find students will have, it's to obey the rests that Legnani indicates in the bass. So let me show you how to clean that up. And I'd consider the 3 techniques I'll show you extremely important because they will help you to control the bass line for all repertoire that you play, whether it's Bach or Brouwer. So when we stop a bass note with our thumb, that's called dampening the bass. And actually in this short little theme, we have to do that in 3 different ways to get the desired effect. And the first way is what you might expect, where we simply touch that note again with our thumb to stop it, like so. As you can see, my thumb prevented the open A from ringing out over the next chord. And if students have any sort of problem with this, it would be that the thumb kind of gets stuck there and it doesn't want to move to the next note. So what I would suggest is that the thumb move in a musical sort of rhythmic way, like so. If I just isolate those 2 little notes, you can see as the fingers follow through, the thumb lifts with it. And if we just isolate those 2 little notes again, we come up with a nice little exercise where we teach the thumb to sometimes stop and to sometimes play. And if this is a new concept, I would highly recommend this exercise. So the second dampening technique is a little bit different, but incredibly versatile. And it involves putting the thumb in between 2 strings to stop the note we just played, but to simultaneously get the thumb ready to play the next string. And here, very early on in the piece, you can see my thumb went in between E and A, stopped the E with the back of the thumb here, and now is ready to play the open A. So the third bass dampening technique is almost exactly like the second. The only difference being is that there's no rest. So we're simultaneously going to stop a string as we prepare to play the next string. And it happens very quickly after a second example, which I'll start from. So I stop in between two strings. I'm going to play an open A. Now here it comes. Right after I play a D, and I don't want to hear this as my bass line. I want to hear something like this. So you can see the thumb bounces off very quickly, leans back, touches the previous string with the back of the thumb, and at the same time gets ready to play the next string. So the whole passage has a lot of bass dampening. As you can see, there's a lot of planning that goes into executing this phrase the way Legnani intended. And I realize it can seem like way too much work to a student who's new to this technique, but eventually it becomes second nature, and of course it gives you much more control of the musical articulations, the bass line in general, and cleanliness. So the second phrase continues with this idea of the thirds, this time flipping the thirds to the lower voice. And in busy passages like this, I think it's a good idea to find some predictable landmarks along the way to help guide your thoughts, and it will serve as a good foundation for when you eventually decide to memorize the piece. So the basic chords are A, D minor, G, C, E, A minor. A very special chord, an Italian sixth chord, and then resolving on the dominant of E. And take note of that very special Italian sixth chord, which is something you hear often in this era, reserved for very special moments in pieces. So, for example, it's in Paganini's famous Romance, right before the apparent fandango section. And most famously in Beethoven's Symphony No. 5. So as I mentioned before, this passage has somewhat of a high likelihood of buzzing because of all the triple stops and all the shifting. And one trick that's worked for me is to always prioritize having a very clean and clear first string, or whatever string happens to be on the top of the passage. For some reason, if the top string is always clear, the rest just seem to follow. And don't forget about that trick we explored in the first video when we have a triple stop passage. Don't be afraid to try it backwards as well. It really helps with the memory, and I think this sort of flexible approach to learning a piece is really, really important to mastering it. Now that we have a good chunk of the piece, I think we can start to discuss some musical ideas to help this piece become as entertaining as possible. As we can see, the theme is marked piano and is relatively fast with an allegretto marking. Although this is subjective, I find a couple of words that best describe what I'm feeling in this passage as sneaky and mischievous. As you can hear, I've added a lot of articulations, particularly staccati, which help fit my vision of the piece. Now we know the theme is coming back in another 8 measures, so I think it's a good idea to contrast that theme musically in some way with the second phrase. And what I do personally, since I've chosen to play the theme in this piano, staccato, sneaky way, is I'll do the opposite for the second phrase. I'll play a bit more mezzo forte and legato. So to demonstrate, when I hit that second theme, definitely louder, letting those high notes sing. And with the written in rallentando there, as the time stretches out more and more, it actually gives the most time to that very special Italian 6 chord. And you can hear when I arrive back at the theme, because of the contrasting character, the arrival of the theme remains effective. In the third section of the piece, we have a dramatic example of pedal point. And to me, this sounds like something you might hear in a symphony or overture. And aside from the repeated note A, we have another A, which splits into 2 notes. And these 2 notes continue to move away from each other in contrary motion until the phrase repeats. And Legnani, the first time this happens, marks in a crescendo, which I think contours that rising line very well. But then the second time it happens, it's kept forte, which drives the music forward until we eventually hit a brick wall. And that in itself I find kind of hilarious, but since it follows up with a theme with such an opposite character, I think it's even more entertaining, keeping in line with what I think a caprice should be. The final passage of the piece is definitely the most virtuosic, and what's happening is we're outlining an A minor arpeggio, but in sort of a jazzy way, meaning we're approaching all these chord tones from a semitone below. Except for the last one. And of course, this goes by very, very quickly, and students at this level might have a problem executing the passage because there's just too much information. So what I suggest is to actually start with this A minor arpeggio, a familiar base for how to attack this passage. And when that's clear, adding in those semitones below. So hopefully when you approach this passage at the end of the piece, you'll see all the notes clearly and you'll be more confident in executing it. Thank you for joining me on this episode. I hope you've enjoyed learning this piece with me. And even if this piece is too advanced or not to your liking, I hope you've learned something that you can carry over to other music. And in the next episode, we're going to be looking at some exercises to help keep your technique very sharp.